ISP.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set live is Shaka Salim South, aka the Kabbalah Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific. You look exquisite.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
To be honest with you, you seem to be getting there. You're beginning to look like a reflection of what someone would characterize as a style setter. Gorgeous Seruk Indonesian shirt.
I will take that compliment. Of course, if I sit around a guy who likes to dress up, I might as well do the same thing, correct?
You might probably mistake me for being a black Italian.
A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. And today we are going to be talking about real politics. There is a lot of happening on the content. I think let's start in Sudan. Shaka, demonstrators have vowed to keep sitting in despite a repeated crackdown by the Khartoum government. It looks like this could be the beginning of the end of the regime. Your thoughts, Shaka?
It's quite possible. You talked about how protesters have continued to actually sit in. I mean, how can they possibly manage to sit in a military barracks, in a military garrison, without the consent of the guys that in fact control that particular garrison?
Interesting point. Earlier today, there were reports of some elements, even yesterday, some elements of soldiers within, of course, the lower ranks have joined the protesters to actually to see through this thing. This could be a revolution that develops legs and starts walking by the time we finish maybe this show.
It probably, in fact, may very well have already developed legs, because the last time I checked, even the police is on record saying that under no circumstances is it in fact going to fight or take on the protesters. And so when you think about it, it looks like the military is only waiting for some particular individual, whether a major, a colonel, or a brave general, who decides to develop the appetite of the highest office in the land. If that individual surfaces and in fact develops the appetite of wanting to be His Excellency, it looks like there may not be very, very much to stop that particular individual, because frankly, the only people who seem to be supporting or at least throwing their weight behind the incumbent, President Omar al-Bashir, are the popular security. And some critic, in fact, was saying that when you talk about the popular security, who happened, by the way, according to him and other sources, essentially a ruling party militia. And I'm sure you remember the name Janjaweed. These were people that were essentially the Sudanese, National Congress Party militias, who caused havoc in Darfur, who caused destruction and mayhem and what have you. These were the people who probably helped, in a way, the current government to stay in power for as long as it has. But right now, if in fact it is true that the military or the security forces are split, and that, as you said earlier, it looks like the demographic changes seem to be, in fact, being reflected in what is going on in terms of the dynamics. The young army officers and soldiers, if in fact it is true that they are beginning to side with the people, then it could very well be game up. Because let's face it, the army has what it takes to hold power and to lose it. They have the weapons, they have the gun, the national militia or the party militia cannot have that much.
What's at stake here?
Well, at stake, when you think about it, is the economy is incredibly stupid. Mind you, when these protests began, they were pretty much responding to the fact that people have to be patriotic to their stomachs. And you had these prices of bread, being, hiked and all that kind of stuff. And when you talk about Sudan, it's as if you are talking about France. Bread is like the primary type of food that you can think about and what have you. And then you have, of course, situations with gasoline, petrol and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of things are complicated, especially because the head of state himself, Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir, you know that he is under the ICC indictment. And because of that, there are a lot of things that normally happen to a country whose head of state, at least is supposed to be in a position where he can interact, where he can get into deals and all that kind of stuff. He is not in a situation really where he can attract business and make a huge difference. So it seems to me that the country is tired. And as I said, it's a question of whether a major, a colonel, or a general develops the appetite of that highest office in the land. It seems to me that could happen anytime from now.
I mean, earlier there were reports of some people killed, and it looks like the army or the regime is going to try to use whatever force that is available to them to try to disperse these crowds. Can they succeed in doing that?
Yeah, but you also have, for example, the first vice president, who also happens to be the defense minister. He addressed the senior military officers and what have you, and said that he is not going to accept or stand the security forces being divided. But the fact that the protesters are still, for example, doing their thing in what appears to be an army barracks, surely that should tell you a lot of things that you are not actually seeing.
Interesting. Let's cross over to Rwanda. They recently celebrated, over the weekend, they commemorated the 25th anniversary of the genocide. And last week we did a show about the Rwandan genocide, what has transpired since then. But we seem to be getting a lot of criticism based on the show. For example, one of the criticisms that came in that I want you to respond to before we go to some of the comments coming in is you talked about how there were no Rwandan Hutu or Twa generals in the Rwandan army. Could you respond to that criticism?
I did not say that there were no Hutu generals in the Rwandan army. I think what I said was, can you show me or tell me whether in fact they are Twa, the pygmies, the guys that in fact are indigenous to that particular area. They are, at least according to conventional historical records, those were the people that occupied that area that we know as Rwanda before the Hutus came in, and the Tutsis and the others. Yes, you see, you do not have a national army in Rwanda. What you have is something that is very close to a mono-ethnic Tutsi army that in fact used to exist in neighboring Burundi, where there was a man with whom in fact you share the last name Ndiho.
Captain Jerome Ndiho.
He was called Jerome Ndiho.
Yes.
He always talked about the army in Burundi is a mono-ethnic Tutsi army. And until and unless we are able, in fact, to replace it with a national army, business is not going to be as usual in Burundi. And by the way, he was right in the sense that I had the opportunity to visit Burundi in 1994 after my trip to the Rwandan capital, Kigali. And as somebody who was at one time a serving officer myself, having been a paratrooper, I had some kind of nostalgia for a sort of romantic, at least, experience in what we used to refer to as the officer's mess, where you would go and hang out with some of your comrades and stuff like that, and drink some beer, and you name it, and exchange some gossip. I was very lucky in the sense that one Colonel Nicodemus Nduhirubusa kindly offered to take me to the officers' mess. I arrived at the officers' mess. There were a lot of young officers, very interesting, and we had a conversation. And then I said, by the way, could you at least show me some 3 or 4 officers who happen to be from the community of the Ganwa? The Ganwa were the traditional ruling class in Burundi. But from the time the king was overthrown by Michombero, they never trusted that type of people, and so they were never promoted actually to become officers. And then I said, what about Hutu? They just laughed. They said, Hutu, we don't have Hutu officers here precisely because they cannot pass the basic military aptitude tests in order to qualify to go to a military academy.
Incredible.
Yes, and they had a good military academy. I said, wait a minute, you seem to be talking as if you were apartheid South Africa at that time. You know, because at the time there were obviously no indigenous South African officers and what have you. And it is, in a way, one of the reasons, in fact, by apartheid South Africa was that the blacks were not smart enough to become officers, to become pilots, to become all sorts of things.
Let's stay in Rwanda. Let's stay in Rwanda.
And so I told them, I said, look at Rwanda, for example. Until recently, there was not a single Tutsi army officer in Rwanda. The army was dominated by the Hutu under President Major General Juvenal Habyarimana. And guess what? When the RPF seized the power, it seemed to have played pretty much the same game. Even though I have to say that to their credit, they were able to promote some individuals to become senior military officers. I remember there was, I think, a very senior military officer called Gasinzi, who had actually been at earlier times a colonel in the Rwandan army under Juvenal Habyarimana. There was also another man by the name of Habyarimana who became a major general, but as we talk, who is now in exile. So it isn't until a country gets the courage, a government gets the courage really, to come up with a national army. And when we talk about a national army, it should be a national army that reflects the reality really. When you talk about it, talk about the social, the cultural, the political, the economic realities of the society. That is the only way you can actually guarantee security and lasting peace.
Let's go to another comment. Camara to David. Does the Rwandan government use the genocide as a political tool to stay in power?
There are some people that have actually been pushing that kind of line, that yes, it is, you know, to some degree, according to them, not me, not myself, but them, that in fact the Rwandan army takes advantage of genocide, exploits genocide in order to, in a sense, to continue being in power. One could probably say that this is something that needs to be researched so that we can actually get, you know, specific evidence that is incontrovertible, not liable to falter, because otherwise, of course, the Rwandan authorities will begin pointing fingers at you that you are a genocide, you know, denier. There are people, for example, who say, is it only the Tutsis, in fact, who were victims of what is called genocide?
There is actually a comment on that. Let's go to John Nyandiwi. Everyone talks about the Tutsi who died, but no one talks about the Hutu who were killed in the Rwandan genocide and Zaire at the time. Does it mean that they were not human?
Of course they were human. And in fact, when you think about it, it is not only Tutsis who actually were killed. There is no question that there are a lot of Hutus and Tutsis who were killed. As a matter of fact, this lady, this political leader by the name Victoire Ingabire, part of the reason she spent a long time in prison is precisely because when she went to the Rwandan capital, Kigali, she had been residing in the Netherlands. She wondered why there was only this memorial that reflects the Tutsis who were victims of genocide, and yet there were no memorials or there were nothing that reminded the people about the thousands and hundreds of thousands of Hutus who actually also died. When you think about it, there was this lady whose last name was Uwiringiyimana. She was in fact the transitional prime minister. She was actually killed by the Rwandan National Army at that time. And in fact, even the Belgian soldiers who were there under the United Nations, peacekeeping, agreement and what have you, who were actually providing a defense, were also, in fact, murdered.
Shaka, how would you respond to people who say that finally President Paul Kagame has been vindicated by the fact that there is this documentary that aired on France 24 talking about France's role in the genocide, how France played a part in the genocide, and President Paul Kagame has been speaking about it very openly, said that France played a major role in the genocide. How do you respond to that criticism?
I think that that is left really for historians, to decide. I think there's been a debate along those lines, and there continues to be a debate. So I think that I will defer to historians at some point. When they do their homework, they will come up with certain conclusions. But when we talk about, the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of genocide, it does not look good when you look at the optics coming out of Kigali and looking at what appears really to be a President Paul Kagame who is virtually politically, at least in terms of regionally and what have you, isolated. I mean, you look at the optics. Where were the neighboring, for example, heads of state? You would have expected them to be there, correct?
Especially after he was the former African Union chairperson.
He was the chairman of the African Union, and
until what, February this year?
Yeah, and the individual, as a matter of fact, who took the baton, received the baton from him also, was mysteriously missing in action. So what does that tell you?
But there are those who said that Rwanda has, despite what happened in 1994, Rwanda has transcended all those difficulties and is now on a trajectory, a positive trajectory, if I might use that word.
I think that there are certain things that are happening in Rwanda. There is no question about it. People talk about, for example, I remember during the program, I was interacting with our colleague, Eddie Rwema, and he was talking about the cleanliness of the Rwandan capital, Kigali, talking about how people were participating in umuganda, which is true, and people in fact help, the city, clean and what have you. But what is not said, and what probably a lot of people may not know, especially those outside of Rwanda, is that it was not the RPF that actually started umuganda. It was, on the contrary, started by the government that had actually been in power before the 1994 genocide. It was, in fact, the government of Habyarimana that had that. So there are certain things that they found there, and it is good that, you know, to their credit, they continued doing them, but they should not, under any circumstances, for example, claim that they are the ones who started them.
Let's go to another comment, Shaka, here. Let's go to Moses Aishaya Lachong. How much knowledge of African politics do you have, Shaka? Because you've never made a concrete design on how to achieve full political stability in Africa and how to deepen democracy. That's a challenge, my friend.
It is very simple because, first of all, I don't honestly see or even know how one could possibly quantify the kind of knowledge that they have either on African politics or American politics. Having said that, I have to say that my knowledge and information about Africa is a work in progress. But I can say sincerely, and I will say this from the deepest bitter part of the bottom of my cavalry heart and soul, that my knowledge and information about African politics as a student and as an observer, I would say that I am far above average in terms of that. I would say that I am definitely reasonably well informed, but under no circumstances am I going to claim, for example, to be an expert on African politics or to claim that I know everything about African politics. And frankly, I do not know whether there is any particular individual that would probably want to be associated with that type of claim, because no one actually is in a position to know everything, no matter who you are.
Well said, well said. Let's move along. Let's go back to North Africa. What do you think of the war in Libya? Is it pushed by the scramble for colonialists' colonial interests to cripple Italy and the other countries that are interested in or have a stake in Libya?
I don't know really that we should think in terms of outsiders. I think first and foremost we should look really at the Libyans themselves. I think that the Libyans themselves are obviously fighting for control of the resources and control of power. Power, as somebody once said, is very good in the sense that you are in a position when you are in charge politically to decide on who gets what, when, where, and why. And I think that's part of the reason why there is, you know, fighting there. Of course, there are also external interests. There's no question that the Italians may be interested because they are at one time were the colonial masters. There's no question that the nearby...
And they have interest in one of their oil leading companies there, Ani. The Italian oil company has a lot of interest in Libya.
Yeah, there is no question that, for example, the neighboring Egyptians themselves have a lot of interest in what happens or doesn't happen in Tripoli.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. You could talk about Algeria. You could talk about Tunisia, which is the next door. So there is, you know, a lot of players when they look at their national interest.
How about you put it in context for us? There are two powers at play right now. There is a regime that is there that is being supported by the international community, and there is another power center that is operating outside of Tripoli, the one that is led by a former general under Muammar Gaddafi. I think it's Khalifa Haftar, something like that, who has ordered his troops to advance and take over Tripoli. How would you maybe characterize that scenario?
Khalifa Haftar is a very interesting man. He's in the 70s now, and by the way, you can't believe that this guy actually joined the military in the 1960s before King Idris was overthrown by young Captain Gaddafi.
And he was part of the revolution.
Well, he wasn't really exactly part of the revolution, but he joined the winners, obviously, who were led with Kagame, with Gaddafi, who overthrew King Idris, supposedly because King Idris, by the way, according to Kagame, or Gaddafi rather, I'm sorry, he had actually said that Idris was essentially a dictator, somebody that was democratically challenged. And when he did not introduce anything that has a semblance or something very close to what he was in fact criticizing, the former king for either having done or not done. And then later, he was a very big general for Gaddafi, especially when they were fighting against Chad. And later, he was, by the way, he was captured by the Chadians, and they took him as a prisoner for many years, until he actually he actually escaped. He was able to escape, and when he escaped, he joined the people this time who were trying to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. In fact, he joined a group which was supported by the United States, which eventually, obviously, seemed to have made a difference in terms of the manner in which Gaddafi finally lost his throne. But you do have a government that is in control, at least, of the Libyan capital, Tripoli. And it is a government that is controlled by it's like a presidential council. And at the same time, the government is said or described as a government of national accord, which, as you rightly said, is at least recognized by the United Nations, and therefore, by extension, the international community.
What are you talking about tomorrow in Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are going to be having a conversation with some former United States ambassadors to Africa. They will be walking us through some of the opportunities and challenges that they encountered or enjoyed in their business of selling the American policy to the countries where they served.
We have about a minute. What do you make of the developments in Algeria, despite the fact that the older ailing leader, Bouteflika, resigned, but we have a new leader and the protesters are still on the streets?
Very interesting, because that leader probably is, in the protesters' view, a reflection or a symbol of what they think they are really against. And we're talking about the National Liberation Front. This is the group that obviously was represented by Bouteflika as president, and is a group, by the way, that came into being back in 1954, as I said last week, and took on arms against Imperial France, defeated France and became independent in 1960. It has actually been in power since then, and has, like all these other liberation groups or freedom fighters and what have you, developed what you would say a sense of entitlement, like Algeria actually belonged to them. So they want a clean sweep, and the changing demographics in tandem with the social media seem
Shaka,
to be
I have to
dangerous.
cut you off. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'll look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
Thank you very much, and I hope one of these days I might also get an opportunity to wear the same shirt.
No problem. I'll hook you up.
Thank you.